So many of you who've seen the news over the last month or so will have seen the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was their 6th assessment report, with their first of their reports dating back to 1990. Sadly, some of the warnings heeded 30 years ago haven't been acted on in anywhere near enough urgency. So the latest report is providing an even more stark and kind of urgent state of evidence in terms of what we know about the impact that we're having on our climate. So worth mentioning, this report features over 230 authors from 65 countries, and this is scientists trawling through all of the academic literature, over 14,000 scientific publications being assessed, and then pulling that all together into one report summarizing what we know about climate change, both in terms of what we've seen already and what we'll see in the future, depending on how much action we take on the issue. Also worth mentioning as well that we owe, I should say, I'm not an IPCC author, so I'm saying this in a non-self-congratulatory way, that we owe a huge debt of thanks, I think, as a society, to these people who give their time as reviewers for free to put together this particular report. And in the next 8 or so minutes, I'll summarize some of the key findings from the IPCC's latest 6th assessment report. So the IPCC conclude, in terms of current climate, that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land, and that the scale of recent changes across the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a little graph which gives a kind of illustration of the changes in temperature that we've seen over the last 2,000 years. And the kind of uptick you can see very clearly on the right-hand side is the increase in global temperatures that we've seen over the last 150 or so years. The IPCC conclude that warming is unprecedented in more than 2,000 years, and that we have experienced the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years. So human actions in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere are destabilizing our climate, and that is clearly evident in the data, and then is having follow-on consequences in terms of the impact that has upon climate around the world and weather patterns. In terms of the impact that climate change has, the IPCC conclude that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. So no areas of the world are free from the impacts that climate change is having. And that manifests in different ways in different areas, but we're seeing more heat waves, droughts, heavy precipitation events, and things like tropical cyclones. So I could have picked out, as I say, any number of different examples. On the right-hand side here is just some of the headlines from the wildfires that we saw in Australia back in 2020, but there could be many other examples I could have chosen to have shown here. So in terms of future climate, the IPCC conclude that global warming of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees will be exceeded during this century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming centuries. So urgent action is needed in order to minimize the chance of experiencing the worst impacts of climate change. And just to give you a bit of indication of kind of where we are now, so if we look at the kind of pre-industrial temperatures, so around 1850, we've already experienced a 1.2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. And many of you may be aware that back in Paris in 2019, all the countries of the world came together and signed something called the Paris Agreement. And that agreed to, the countries agreed to try and keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And following that agreement, all the countries of the world are required to submit what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And you'll see a lot of this in the news in the next month or so. Hopefully we'll do, in terms of the forthcoming climate summit in Glasgow, and hopefully countries stepping up their ambition. But it's worth saying that on the basis of the NDCs submitted by countries across the world so far, we're currently on course for a 2.4 to a 2.9 degree rise in global temperatures. And of course, it's worth pointing out as well that these NDCs are pledges, but obviously there can be a difference between what is pledged and what is actually met. So a few things are really important. Firstly, that countries increase their ambition within their nationally determined contributions, and that's something that really needs to come out of the summit taking place in Glasgow. But it's also incumbent, obviously, for us to make sure that those targets are actually met. That's absolutely essential. But just to summarize a few more of the key headline statements. So looking in terms of future climate, the IPCC conclude that continued global warming is projected to further intensify the global water cycle, including its variability, global monsoon precipitation, and the severity of wet and dry events. And as with some of the previous graphics, I could have included any number of images on the right-hand side here. I chose to pick out the recent floods caused by Storm Ida on the east coast of America. I could equally have picked out images of the floods in London just a month or two ago, or in Germany a couple of months ago, where almost 200 people died as a result of very extreme rainfall events. So I guess it emphasizes two things: both the urgency with which we need to reduce emissions, but also the need to adapt our cities, our urban areas, our rural areas as well, to be more resilient to some of the changes that we are already seeing and we will continue to see in the future as the climate warms. So one other thing, just to kind of finish off on from the kind of headlines from the IPCC report, was that limiting human-induced global warming to a specific level requires reaching at least net zero carbon dioxide emissions, with strong reductions in other greenhouse gas emissions as well. And you may be familiar that the IPCC published a report 2 or 3 years ago, which looked at how we can avoid a 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures. And they concluded that it's still possible, but that rapid change is required. We need to roughly halve global emissions of greenhouse gases by around 2030. And they also concluded that the majority of the technologies that we need to achieve this are there, but they need to be scaled up rapidly. And so I'll finish off here with just some very brief reflections on the important role that towns, cities, and local authorities have to play in helping to tackle and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So as I'm sure you're all aware, in many countries around the world, a high proportion of our citizens live in urban areas. So our cities, our towns, have a really important role to play in engaging our citizens in ways which help them to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. And it's been great to see leadership from cities, particularly in America, over the last 5 or so years, I guess, when there's not been national level leadership on climate change. The cities have really stepped up to take action in this area. And over here in the UK, where I'm based, we've also seen over 2/3 of local authorities now declaring climate emergencies and setting net zero targets. So we've seen really important leadership from the local level. And for me, what needs to happen is a greater recognition of the importance of towns and cities and local authorities in achieving net zero and reducing emissions. And that's a combination, I think, of both more power in terms of the devolution of powers that allow that to happen, but also in some cases a devolution of resources as well, from national governments giving more resources to the local level to help make that change happen. I touched on earlier the importance of reducing emissions, but also of clearly aligning our emissions of a reduction of emissions with adapting to a warmer climate as well. We are going to see increases in temperatures and increase in precipitation as long as greenhouse gases continue to rise. So it's really important that while taking actions to reduce emissions, we also try and align those actions with ways which we can help to adapt our urban environments to be more resilient to warmer climates, so that we're less impacted when there are these heavy rainfall events, so that the impact that it has upon people is much less severe. And just to finish off, you all know the kind of, and you have 101 different, I guess, challenges that you face in your day-to-day lives and your jobs, in terms of the other challenges that you're facing at a local level, whether that be improving air quality or tackling poverty or improving housing quality and so on. And it's really important that we look to align action on climate change with those other priorities. And I guess the good news is there are so many things that are good for climate change that are also really good for improving people's lives. And I'll just finish off with this kind of what I think is one of the nicest cartoons about climate change. It's actually back from 2009, and the cartoon is of this scientist presenting some of the benefits that action on climate change brings. So things like energy independence, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, cleaner air, healthier children, cleaner water, and so on. And the guy in the audience says, well, what if it's a big hoax and we created a better world for nothing? Well, we clearly know the climate change is no hoax. It's a really, really important issue. We also know that addressing it can make our urban environments, our cities, towns and centres so much more attractive for people to live in and to shop in and to be around. And I'd like to thank all of you for the work you do in helping to make that happen.